And now, documents have surfaced that reveal that the so-called Arab Spring didn't start in the Muslim world. Well, where did it start? It started from plans in the United States to take over the Middle East, its natural resources, for the Western world. But their Arab Spring is not going the way they originally intended. And it has now turned into a harsh Arab winter. And this is to say to America that even though you plan, there is a planner over and above your plans who fulfills the scriptures that says in the Bible that you will lay a trap for others and get caught in it. You will dig a ditch for others, but you will fall in it. A 4-star U.S. Army General Wesley Clark. Have you heard that name before? Let me tell you what he said. He said that 10 years before 9/11, Paul Wolfowitz. I want you to keep remembrance of these names because these are part of a shadow government. Let me say it again. These are part of a shadow government. A shadow government means you got a government out front, but you got another government behind that are trumping the things that the government out front is saying. Now I'm going to prove what I say. You can take it or let it alone, but you'll never be able to say that Farrakhan knew the truth and was too cowardly to tell it, even at the cost of my own life. Mr. Clark said Wolfowitz, the neocon architect of Bush's war on Iraq, told him of plans to clean out the Middle East and take over those Muslim nations. Just 10 days after 9/11, Clark was shown a Pentagon memo that describes how they planned to take out 7 countries, Muslim countries, in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and then Iran.
Because I'd been through the Pentagon right after 9/11. About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
And then Syria.
We had a chance to talk about a wide range of international issues, including the situation in Syria. And I have to say that all of us who've been seeing the terrible pictures coming out of Syria and Homs recently recognize it is absolutely imperative for the international community to rally and send a clear message to President Assad that it is time for a transition. It is time for that regime to move on, and it is time to stop the killing of Syrian citizens by their own government.
Lebanon.
They both had different reasons, the State Department and the White House, for wanting Israel to do it, encouraging them to do it, supporting them. Our Air Force worked very closely with the Israeli Air Force for months before this, not necessarily with a deadline, knowing when it would happen. It was always going to be whenever there was an incident, they would take advantage of an incident. The word I used was fortunate timing. When the Hezbollah grabbed some of the Israeli soldiers in early July, that was then a pretext, I think that's the only word, for a major offensive that had been in the works a long time.
Libya.
Today we can definitively say that the Gaddafi regime has come to an end. The last major regime strongholds have fallen. The new government is consolidating the control over the country, and one of the world's longest-serving dictators is no more.
Somalia.
Well, violence isn't only on the rise in Afghanistan. In fact, it looks like America's shadow wars have now increased by one. Drone strikes have long been reported in Pakistan and Yemen, but now there's news that a week ago, the U.S. drone aircraft fired on 2 leaders of the Somalian organization Al-Shabaab.
Sudan.
President Obama is sending 100 combat-equipped troops to Central Africa to advise local forces on getting rid of one of the continent's most vicious operatives, Joseph Kony, the head of the Lord's Resistance Army, a group responsible for atrocities across the region. It's the first open deployment of U.S. ground combat power to Africa since the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia in the 1990s that killed 18 troops. U.S. troops may wind up now in Uganda, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's part of a growing military effort to engage in Africa.
Finishing off, Iran.
No matter who wins the election, that president would have to guide America through the most difficult time in world affairs. Mr. Trump is that leader today. And Elijah Muhammad taught me that I should say to him, you would be wise, Mr. Trump, to delay the storm as long as you can, because the longer the storm is delayed is to not only America's advantage, but is to the advantage of the world. These sanctions are the predicate for a new war. A reporter asked my teacher, is America going to remain in the Middle East? And my teacher said, America is going to come out of the Middle East. And when they asked about war, he said, yes, there would be war. And he said, bloodshed in this area would be much. I am begging our president and the government that supports him to be very, very careful, because if the trigger of war in the Middle East is pulled by you using your surrogates at the insistence of Israel, then the war will trigger another kind of war which will bring China, Russia, all of the nations into a war. And it bothers me to say this to you, Mr. President, but the war will end America as you know it. So when these Iranians chant death to America, death to Israel, no chant can bring about your death, but it is your policies that are eroding trust for you in the world, favor for you in the world. And now you're pulling apart, confused. And if you do this, you will bring about, not the Iranian chant, you will bring about the death of the greatest nation that has been on this earth in the last 6,000 years. I am a warner to you. I am a friend to America, not an enemy. But if you do not heed the warning and correct your path, death will come. They call this project the Greater Middle East Project. But for the public and the media, they're calling it the Arab Spring. Journalist and historian William Engdahl is reporting that some of the Arab protest leaders were trained to be instigators in Belgrade, Serbia, by activists financed by the U.S. State Department. Now, look here. If the State Department is financing this, let's see what Mr. Engdahl has to say more. He said the ultimate goal of the United States is to take the resources of Africa and Middle East under military control in order to block economic growth in China and Russia, thus taking the whole of Eurasia under control. Now, you may not know it now, but America is already at war with China and Russia. Well, wait a minute now, Farrakhan. I think you're going a little far. No, I haven't gone far enough. We had a seminar yesterday called Business is Warfare. America is at war right now with China and Russia. I'll prove it in a minute. You just hang in there with me. You can't get this nowhere in America but by the voice of a man trained by God's apostle, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Engdahl goes on to say, the Pentagon's Africa Command, called AFRICOM, is coordinating the whole operation. Now, Engdahl said, he's a historian and scholar, but either he's lying or he's telling the truth. He says, interestingly, AFRICOM was created just after 2006, China's Africa diplomacy, when 40 heads of African nations were invited to Beijing, China, and enormous deals were signed on oil exploration, building hospitals and infrastructure, anything the IMF did not do in Africa over the last 30 years. China and Russia has been in Africa working with African governments. Now think about this. In China, in Libya, when the fighting started, nearly 100,000 Chinese had to leave Libya. They weren't in Libya sightseeing. They were working throughout Libya, building infrastructure for development. And when NATO started bombing, Gaddafi said, no more oil to Europe. But Russia and China, they had to kill him. It's warfare. And anybody that gets in the way has to be dealt with. Today, I'm putting myself in your way. I want you to come and deal with me so that my God can show you that I'm not standing by myself.